Welcome to the second video of lesson 7.2.4. If you haven't already watched the first video and wish you did problem 7-152, please go ahead and watch that video now. It'll be linked in the description below. So for this problem, please go ahead and read problem 7-153. Pause the video now to read. Now that you've read the problem, please read part A and think about what it's asking you to do. Please pause the video to read part A now. Now that you've read part A, you can see that it's asking for you to choose the amplitude of your graph. I'm choosing the amplitude of 2, so please pick a different amplitude than I am choosing. So I'm choosing 2, so please pick a different amplitude. Now that you've chosen your amplitude, please read part B and think about what it's asking you to do. Pause the video now to read part B. Now that you've read part B, it's asking you to choose a horizontal shift. So I'm choosing a horizontal shift of pi over 2. So please choose a horizontal shift that is something other than pi over 2. Please choose your horizontal shift now. Now that you've already chosen your horizontal shift, please read part C. Pause the video now to read part C and think about what it's asking you to do. Part C is asking you to choose the midline of your function. I chose -1, so please choose something other than -1 for the midline of your function. Pause the video now to choose your midline. Now that you've chosen your midline, please pause the video to read part D and think about what it's asking you to do. Part B is asking you to choose what the period of your function will be. I chose 4 pi, so please choose something other than 4 pi for the period of your function. Please pause the video now to choose the period of your function. Now that you've chosen the period of your function, please read part E. Pause the video now to read part E. Now that you've read part E, let's talk about what it's asking you to do. Part E is asking what the orientation of your graph would be. So is it going to be a sine graph or a cosine graph? Is it the same or is it flipped? So I'm going to choose a cosine graph. You can choose a sine graph if you want. You can choose a cosine graph if you want. That's up to you. Please choose the orientation of your graph now. And if it's going to be flipped, I'll have mine flipped. Yours can be flipped or not. That's also up to you. Now that you've chosen the orientation of your graph, please read part F and think about what it's asking you to do. Now that you've read part F, let's talk about it. It's asking you to now write an equation for all of these attributes. Now that you've chosen the amplitude, the horizontal shift, midline, period, and the orientation, it wants you to write an equation for this function. Go ahead and pause the video now and do your best to write an equation for your function. Now that you've taken the time to write your equation, let's go ahead and talk about this equation right here. So, y equals, and these parentheses will tell you if your graph is flipped or not. My graph is flipped, so I will have a negative sign here. If your graph wasn't flipped, then you would have a positive sign. Then it's times A for amplitude. My amplitude is 2, so I'm going to have a 2 right here. I chose cosine, so cosine of, and I need to find my B. So if you remember from last lesson, 7.2.3, we found out that the period is equal to 2 pi over B. I know that my period is 4 pi, so I know that 4 pi equals 2 pi over B. So let's go ahead and solve for that B. First, I'm going to multiply both sides by B to get 4 pi B equals 2 pi. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 4 pi to get that b is equal to 1/2. So now I have this 1/2, and then I have a parentheses. This parenthesis is very important. I have my x minus h is our horizontal shift. My horizontal shift is pi over 2, so I'm going to write pi over 2 right here. Then we close the parentheses for that little section, and we close the parentheses for the cosine. Then plus k. K is our midline. My midline is at -1, so I'm going to add -1, which is the same as subtracting 1. So go ahead and check that your equation has all of the parts written correctly, and then try to graph it using Desmos. And draw your graph on your notes. So go ahead and graph using Desmos to help you, and draw your graph on your notes. Pause the video now to check your equation and graph it. Now that you've graphed your equation, let's see what happens when we graph mine. So my equation was y equals -2 times cosine of 1/2. Then I had a parenthesis. Remember that parenthesis is important. X minus pi over 2, parenthesis, parenthesis, minus 1. So if I want to see if everything worked out correctly like I wanted to, we could just look at the graph. So I said that I wanted my graph to be flipped, so that means that it'll start at the negative part, like a cosine graph would normally start at the top, so a flipped cosine graph will start at the bottom. Mine is shifted over pi over 2, so let's see if this bottom point is shifted over pi over 2, which it is. My midline was -1, so let's see if my midline in this case is -1. We can check that by just typing in y equals -1 and see that divides our graph directly in half, if you can see. So I know that my shift worked out, my midline worked out. Now let's check my amplitude. The distance from -3 to -1 is 2. The distance from -1 to 1 is 2. So yes, my amplitude is in fact 2. Lastly, I want to check if my period is 4 pi. So I started at pi over 2, so I should end 4 pi later. So if we're going to be looking at pi's over 2, it would be 9 pi over 2. So let's see. So we ended on 9 pi over 2. So that's 4 pi later, so that means that my period is in fact 4 pi. Make sure to check that your graph works out with your numbers that you plugged in, and if it didn't, double check where your parentheses and everything goes to make sure that you understand how to correctly write your graph, your equation for your graph. If you have any questions about today's lesson, be sure to log in to Google Meets for your class. Check with your teacher to find out what time your Google Meets are. Thank you, and see you in the next video.